Morning. Right, well, good morning to everyone. Should start off, the Lord be with you. It's good to see everyone here this morning. I want to mention, last week I was out of town, and so I watched Andrea Ramsey on YouTube. I thought that was just fantastic, her presentation. And her retelling of Sojourner's Truth, Aren't I a Woman speech, I really wish I was here in person. I thought that was really stunning. I have read that speech or parts of it before, but Andrea just brought out a lot of new dimensions to it. And gee, we're going to maybe take a field trip up to Akron sometime and maybe to Maryland. Who knows, what we will do with all of that. Related to that, Michael gave me this. There is a fund, the Sojourner Truth Statue Fund that has been launched, where leaders in Summit County are coming together to put something up to recognize and honor Sojourner Truth. And so you can donate to the fund. We have, this is the sole piece of information we have right now at our disposal, although yeah, there's an online website and so forth. But I will leave this here if you're interested after so you can look at it after we're done this morning. Anyway, thanks so much to Andrea for bringing those. Also, 2 weeks ago, after I talked about Frederick Douglass, I got an email from Judge Jack Milligan asking a couple of really great questions, but one of them, he asked, why didn't I mention Frederick Douglass's tremendous influence on the constitutional issue of emancipation and Abraham Lincoln? And my response to him was, yeah, why didn't I mention that? I missed a very important point, and this is actually why we need each other. And so this morning I want to just go back briefly and make a point. One last further note about Frederick Douglass to talk about this and why he was important. Douglass, as a key spokesperson in America who had his own newspaper, his own writings, made speeches, met Abraham Lincoln in person a couple of times, but really had this public voice, had a key role in influencing Northern Republican politicians and Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War on two very important points. Number one, about emancipation, and his argument, as well as some other abolitionists, was that if the Union issued the emancipation order, it will help the Union win the war. They can do it constitutionally because, he argued, the southern states were in rebellion. It's a war measure, but the bigger thing is it will weaken the Confederacy, because in a number of different ways, but that in essence all this slave labor was supporting the Confederate war effort, and this will really undermine him. And the second thing, after the Emancipation Proclamation, that Frederick Douglass argued, he led the campaign to say blacks need to be able to become soldiers. They need to fight for the Union. And Union policy, starting in 1861, was blacks could not become soldiers. The Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, actually said, this is a white man's war. It was built on stereotypes of blacks as being undisciplined and lazy and cowardly, and the thought was they would not make good soldiers. And if you've seen the movie Glory, that gets into these issues in a number of different ways. And Frederick Douglass said, they will fight, and they will fight well. And he was right on both points. And let me just pull up a little bit of evidence. Oh, my goodness. I do have a tendency to drop things, but boy, this morning. I got some evidence to show this. Frederick Douglass, in arguing to Abraham Lincoln, 500,000 slaves ran away during the Civil War, and most of them ran away to the Union Army. Inadvertently, the Union Army took on the role of the Underground Railroad, a moving Underground Railroad. Everywhere it went in the South, enslaved people, when they were close by, thousands, hundreds, hundreds of thousands, literally ran away to the Union Army. 1 out of every 8 enslaved persons was able to run away during the Civil War. That's 12% of the workforce. It's just gone. So you think about what happens if we wake up tomorrow and 12% of the workforce in the American economy is gone. You can imagine what a big blow that would be to the economy. And it was a big blow to the Confederacy. So Frederick Douglass was right about that. And then 180, after the Emancipation Proclamation, 180,000 blacks served as troops in the Union Army. 150,000 of these were young enslaved men who had run away and then signed up to fight for the Union. And an extra 200,000 fugitives helped out the Union military in other ways. Just to give you an idea, Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia, the most men he ever had under his control in Northern Virginia at any one time was about 80,000. So you add 180,000 to the Union side of things, you can see what a huge difference that would be. Black men enlisted at a higher rate than any other people group in the Civil War. So Frederick Douglass was right about that. And it's significant for our thinking about what we are doing here with African American religious biography, because it is important, of course, that we listen to and hear the stories of black people. That is important for a lot of different reasons. But there's another dimension also, and that is we also need to realize ways that African Americans have influenced history, not just their own experience, but how they've influenced the larger picture in a number of different ways. And for more than a century after the Civil War, to give one example, white historians told the story of the Civil War. And many white historians were concerned about racism, but that doesn't mean they asked the same questions or studied the same things that black historians were looking at. And there were black historians starting in the 1890s who were writing about the Civil War and Reconstruction and saying, wait a minute, you need to look at this. And basically, nobody paid attention to them. And eventually, after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, then the wider historical body in academia began paying much more attention to black historians and also to the black experience in the United States. And by doing that, suddenly things like Frederick Douglass and the influence of black soldiers, or the Underground Railroad and enslaved people who ran away, suddenly we see things that we did not see before. And it gives us a different picture and a different understanding, a fuller picture and a fuller understanding of what happened in American history. And that now has been going on in academia for 4 decades or so, and it's been filtering down into the popular level in different ways. And it's a project that's still going on. But there's a Christian virtue here, and this will be, I think, a theme for this morning. And the Christian virtue is that we need to listen to one another, and it takes some humility to do. Talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours, which really would not be beneficial to any of us. So I have to make decisions about what to include and what not to include, just to give you one example. And that's true of any textbook, any documentary, any sort of book that's ever written historically. Somebody's making a decision about what to talk about and what not to talk about. But this is why I need people like Judge Milligan, who say, hey, what about Frederick Douglass's impact on Abraham Lincoln? Say, oh yeah, that's right. I need to include that. This is why I'm so glad we have Andrea Ramsey here to give us her insights and her perspectives on things. And so there's a problem in history if whites, even well-meaning whites with good intentions, set the terms that everybody else has to respond to. What we need is a system where we've got all kinds of voices at the table, listening to one another. And so the question for this morning is, who sets the terms that others have to respond to, and how do those terms get set? And that brings us to one of our main persons this morning, a man by the name of Henry McNeill Turner. He can help us see these issues. He was born in 1834. I didn't put his dates up there, and lived until 1915. Not a real famous individual, not like many of the others we've talked about so far, but one of the more important black church officials in the late 19th century. He organized blacks in the South after the Civil War into churches, into black independent churches, mainly the Methodist AME Church, led revivals. He was a spokesperson for African Americans in the 19th century. He actually formed a missionary movement of the black church to South Africa that established connections between black Christians in the United States and black Christians in South Africa that has continued to this day. He was an early promoter of black pride, which we will get to. So a brief biography, very brief, a little bit about his life. He was born as a free black in South Carolina in 1834. At the age of 12 years old, he had a dream in which millions of people were looking to him for instruction. And much later in life, Turner said that he described this as a special call from God about what he was supposed to do. At age 19, he was licensed by the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was the southern white-dominated Methodist denomination, and he preached and led revivals primarily among blacks in the South. Then he discovered, right before the Civil War, he discovered this other denomination that was also Methodist, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? And we talked about Richard Allen forming this church in Philadelphia, this denomination, and that appealed to Turner because here was an independent black denomination, and he joined that denomination, and for the next number of years, in his 20s, preached in the North and became known as a very powerful and effective preacher. And his reputation grew. During the Civil War, he then became the first black to be a chaplain in the United States Army. After black soldiers were taken on in the Civil War, he went with black troops in the South as their chaplain. And in that process, and we'll see a couple of examples of what this does to him, but he encounters blacks in the South who are now becoming freed people once again, and that is going to be where his main work will be for the rest of his life. After the war, he was elected bishop in the AME Church and helped, as I mentioned, organize blacks in the South, especially in Georgia, and independent black churches. He served a term in the Georgia state legislature during Reconstruction as a state congressman. To understand, though, the context, we need to think about a few things about Reconstruction at this point. This era, really approximately 10 years after the Civil War ends and what that does in the South. And to understand some dynamics. If we were to go to, say, June of 1865, where the war has ended and Juneteenth, June 16th, finally, in the far reaches of the South, in Texas, the news comes that the war has ended and that slavery has been abolished, and everybody now knows. Everybody knows slavery is over, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions hovering in the air. Okay, so slavery is over, but what does this mean about a lot of other things? What kind of labor system are you going to have in the South to replace slavery? What rights do blacks have? What rights should blacks be given? What role are they going to play in politics and the economy? What are social relations between blacks and whites going to be? That's all up in the air and undecided. And so we come to our question, how do these terms get set? And who's going to make the decision? And there are a lot of groups kind of jockeying for position here, but it's really, we can divide it into three major groups, although there's subdivisions. Human beings, we're complicated. But you have Southern whites, Southern blacks, and then northern whites who are primarily connected to the Union Army who are occupying the South. And for a while, you're going to have an interaction between these three major groups. Henry McNeill Turner was very aware of the dynamics that were going on here. He wrote for his denominational newspaper, the Christian Recorder, which was all denominations had a national newspaper at this time, which were actually really fairly popular. And I was reading through these, doing some research, and I came across a couple of very interesting stories that Henry McNeill Turner recounted. This one comes right towards the end of the war I'm going to give to you. And what happened was that Turner's in North Carolina, and he's with black troops and the Union Army, and you know, they are kind of administering the area. And a black woman comes up to Henry McNeill Turner for help. Her child had been taken away from her by the former owner, her former slave owner. So Turner went to the home of the former slave owners and confronted the woman, the white woman, who was married to the man who was gone with this little black child. And so then Turner gave this conversation that he had with this white woman. He said, "Have you got this woman's child?" "No, her master's carried it off." "Where is her master, as you call him?" "Well, he's gone into the country." "What did he carry the child away for?" "Because he wanted to." "Did he not know the child belongs to this woman?" "Yes, but if it is her child, it is his Negro." That's a telling phrase right there, right? It's her child, but it's his Negro. And we'll come back to that. "You Yankees have such impudence. What are you meddling with our Negroes for? You may think the South is conquered because she has surrendered to superior numbers, but, sir, you are sadly mistaken." "Stop, stop," I replied. "I don't want any more of your rebel parlance. You are not too good to be hung, and you had better dry up or you might get a rope around your neck in short order." Okay, so things are getting tense. And at that point, a Union officer rides up. And she turns to the white, it's a white Union officer, turns to him and begins arguing, about the problems that Turner's creating for him and so, or for her, and so forth. And they're going back and forth. And finally, Turner interrupted them. And he tells the white officer, "It is reported that the child is hid in town, but she says her husband has taken it into the country. I now propose, as he has 5 children standing here, that we take one to be held as hostage until the colored child is returned to its mother." Well, the words were hardly out of my mouth before such a running, crying, and squealing took place among the children that my indignation melted down into laughter. The very utterance of these words frightened the poor children nearly to death and made the mother tremble. At this juncture, learning that the general had taken the matter in hand, I left. But look at the inconsistency. They could not feel the colored woman's grief. Yet when the same pill was offered to them, they were frightened to fits. To have taken one of their children, you would have pronounced by the slave oligarchs an act of fiendish cruelty. But for them, to perpetuate the same crime on a poor colored woman was only an inconsiderable circumstance. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, realize what really a challenge you have in the South, because slavery is over, but that doesn't mean that the mindset and thinking of whites in the South has changed in terms of their attitude and thinking about the blacks among them. They've grown up thinking blacks are enslaved people. Slavery is over, but they're still wanting to perpetuate this sort of unequal relationship in some sort of way. That's going to be a real difficulty. How do you change an entire population's way of thinking? I don't have an easy answer for that. But the other problem is, we go back to our question, who's going to call the shots? And here you can see, you have, white Southerners, you have the white Union general, and you've got blacks, all sort of in this power dynamic. going back and forth among one another. So blacks were ready to not only leave slavery behind, but to leave the old social relationships behind where blacks and whites would be treated equally. The problem is that for whites, they do accept that slavery is over. Most of them, some of them actually, well, they had to accept it. It's like the law. The Union is going to enforce the abolition of slavery, whether old rebel fighters or whoever are going to want that or not. But then they're not necessarily going to change their thinking about relations with blacks. There were some whites, a very few of them, who said, okay, we've got to figure out on a more equal basis how blacks and whites are going to live together. But they were a small minority. And notice here, you know, the white woman is trying to appeal to the white general, saying, wait a minute, we're on the same side here, right? Appeal on the basis of race. Because we're whites and we understand, don't we? And then she discovers, no, the Union general does not side with her. So here then, on those power dynamics, is a short, very simplified story of what happens in Reconstruction. And that was this. As long as the Union Army occupied the South, blacks were given freedoms and opportunities. Now, not all Northerners were, there were Northerners who were really quite racist also, but official authority was to give blacks a certain amount of freedom and opportunity. These are things that were being worked out during Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, blacks actually were allowed not only to vote, but to run for office. And Henry McNeill Turner himself served as a legislator in the Georgia state legislature. There were blacks who were elected governor, blacks who were elected senator and congressman. They weren't a majority, but they were starting to be welcomed in to equal positions in a lot of these areas. Schools were being set up in the South. There were colleges that were being set up in the South and so forth. But when the Army pulls out, that is officially the end of Reconstruction, and it varies from state to state, but it finally ends in 1876 everywhere. Slowly, well, sometimes maybe not so slowly, Southern whites regain power. Some of this is through politics, through the Democratic Party, which became, or really was, and had been the party that was most fiercely for white supremacy. And some of it's through violence. The Ku Klux Klan forms. Henry McNeill Turner's life several times was threatened by the Ku Klux Klan. He escaped death very closely a couple of times. And then later, when whites were able to gain power, essentially in the 1870s and 80s, then they start implementing segregation. It actually didn't happen right at the end of the war. It actually happened in the 1880s and 90s. And they will use politics and violence to enforce it. In lynching, and later on Andrea's going to talk about Ida Wells, lynching will be a way that you keep in line any blacks who are stepping out of line. So the result is, in the long term, whites end up calling the shots in the major institutions, and blacks do not have a voice, or they get marginalized. You know, by the time we get to, say, 1900, whites are dominating government, economics, education, except for a few maybe black colleges, the media, social relations. It extends to a lot of other things. And by the way, this starts spreading to the North also. The North, in essence, just sort of gave up on blacks in the South in large part. Said that's a Southern problem, we're not going to deal with it. And then, but a lot of this racism reemerged in the North in powerful ways. So athletics, I think, is, I'll give you one example that illustrates. Frederick Douglass' son played professional baseball in the 1870s. And then he was forced out. Black professional baseball players were forced out of integrated leagues in the 1880s. Segregation came to baseball, and that's why Jackie Robinson in 1947 breaks the color barrier. He was actually not the first black professional baseball player. If you go back to the time of Reconstruction, there was a time where in the North, blacks and whites played together, but they were forced out during this time. So that comes back to our story, and I think this is what's significant. Religion the churches were one of the few, maybe the only major institution where blacks could set the terms for themselves. Everywhere else, they're having to respond to whites who are in power. And that's because religion in the United States, since the founding, has been very, very decentralized. We don't have an established church. We have guaranteed freedom of religion. Now, did not happen under slavery. If you go back to the time under slavery, what happened is there was not religious freedom for blacks in the South. There were all kind of laws in the South based on slavery that greatly restricted religious freedom for blacks. So if you think about, it was illegal to teach blacks to read and write. That has a huge impact on whether you can read the Bible. Illegal to ordain black ministers. Illegal for slaves to hold religious meetings without white supervision. And this is why sometimes you hear the phrase steal away, maybe in some of the old black. That's because the white masters would say, hey, if you're going out meeting by yourself, you're stealing my time and my labor. And, you know, and the enslaved people were like, yeah, okay, we're going to do that because we're going to worship. You know, we're going to steal away to the brush arbor and worship anyway. Many slave owners wouldn't allow slaves to hold religious services during the week. Some prohibited all religious services. I mean, it really varied from place to place. There were actually a few black ministers who were executed for preaching illegally. And some enslaved people wanted to get baptized but couldn't because the master would not let them. Now, it varied. Some places, you know, like Charles Colcock Jones was trying to, even with his racism, he was, you know, trying to encourage black Christianity, but it just varied from place to place. But if you think, yes, Courtney. Yeah, and it's the same reason why blacks were not covered by the Bill of Rights. Could not serve on juries. It's like they're not citizens. They do not apply to them. They are not American citizens. They are enslaved people, which is why it's going to be so important to have the 14th Amendment that guarantees citizenship regardless of race. Yeah, it's a very good question. And we don't think, here's this land of freedom, but really, legally, it's not extending it. All right, the Civil War comes, abolishes slavery, right? And now you've got a new situation. But if you think about the dynamic here, and I think this is important for understanding what happens to the black church after the Civil War. As one freed person told a northern white missionary, you know, who was in a church dominated by whites, we couldn't tell no preacher never how we suffered all these years. He knew nothing about us. So here he is going to church with the whites in the white church. It's like, he doesn't know my situation. He doesn't know what, and there's reasons, right? If you're an enslaved person, you got to be very, very careful about what you say or what you don't say to that person who has that sort of power. All right. Enter Henry McNeil Turner in the South. Here is a black preacher saying, I can come, I can set up a denomination, I can set up a church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, with black preachers. Now that appeals to a lot of blacks in the South. And he'd encounter situations where blacks were just thrilled by the very presence of a black preacher. You see why that is. Here's somebody who understands me. Here's somebody who knows what I am, I can go through. Here's somebody I can trust and I can go to. Now, just a little sidelight here. At first, Henry McNeil Turner was still a little embarrassed, maybe, by some of the freed people. He certainly wanted to set up churches in the South at the end of the Civil War. But I've got this quote. Oh, the foul curse of slavery has blighted the natural greatness of my race. It has transformed many into an inhuman appearance. Let a person get a little animated, fall down and roll over a while, kick a few shins, crawl under a dozen benches, spring up on his feet, knock some innocent person on the nose, set it bleeding, then squeal and kiss or bust around for a while, and the work is all done. He's talking about black worship. What is this stuff? If the individual had claimed justification under more quiet circumstances, its legitimacy would have been doubted. He's a little embarrassed by the enthusiasm and the ecstatic nature of black Christians in the South. And this is something, there were blacks in the North who were a bit embarrassed by this because for some of them, they wanted to prove to whites that blacks were respectable, responsible, competent citizens. Because they faced discrimination and prejudice in the North, they wanted to show, no, we can be just as upstanding and respectable as you are. And so then when they'd see other blacks who were not acting in a respectable way, they'd get kind of embarrassed and they're like, you guys got to clean up your act here. There's a little bit of this dynamic and glory there's one character from the North, and he runs into the Denzel Washington character, if you ever watched that movie, and they've got a little bit of conflict going on there. But Henry McNeill Turner didn't stay in that position for very long. At first, and he realized he's writing this in this newspaper mostly to free blacks in the North, so he may be concerned about that. But as he worked with the freed people, he began to change his views. He's found that Southern blacks were brave, independent, and fearless, with none of this foolish crouching before white men. The ablest historian, the greatest orator, and the most skillful architect and mechanic I've ever seen were all slaves in the South. He found a man named Joseph H. Jennings, who he found to be a very powerful preacher, a poorly educated man, but incredibly gifted. He said, and by some hook and crook, I made him an assistant elder, and a hero he is. I am not much for shouting, but I think a man is excusable for shouting when Jennings gets a hold of him. I could almost excuse a horse. The freed people impress Turner with their gifts, their skills, their enthusiasm, their courage under very, very difficult situation. Oh, what zeal and determination they manifest in their efforts to serve God. I have to admire it as much as I admire the soldiers' prayer meeting in my regiment. And so Turner quickly changes and realizes, oh no, we've got something really valuable here among these freed people. They have gifts, they have skills, and they have courage. And he begins looking around everywhere for preachers among the freed people, among the poorly educated freed people, to lead congregations everywhere that he went. And so as a bishop in the 1860s and 70s, he started giving licenses and ordaining ministers who were often very poorly educated. Some of them were even illiterate. He sometimes just asked them, can you preach? Good enough. Because he recognized the importance of black leadership in this situation where whites are calling the shots in so many other areas and so many other places. And sometimes he'd just say, well, can you sing and pray, if they weren't sure about the preaching part? Good enough. And he later claimed that he gave them all a long examination, but it seems from the records that if somebody was interested in evangelizing and were willing to undergo further education, that was good enough. And he licensed preachers on street corners and train trips and filled out preaching certificates on whatever surface he could find around him. And this is what's going on, and I use Turner as just one example of many. This is what's going on throughout the South in the black church. And you could call this actually an African-American Great Awakening. Because, and what happens here is two things. Number one, you have a lot of black Christians who were attending white churches under slavery who are now switching over to independent black churches. But you also have a huge number of blacks who were never Christians before under slavery, who are now joining the church. In tremendous growth, and you can see this in the statistics. We don't know for sure exactly what the percentage of blacks who were Christian under slavery, and I've seen historians are trying to piece this together anywhere from 10 to 22%. And so some people say maybe the best guess is maybe 17%, but even if it's the highest, 22%, look at that compared to 1900, when 42% of blacks are claiming official membership in churches. It's 42% of the population. So you get growth, Black Baptists from 400,000 to 2.2 million. I mean, some of that is just growth in terms of, children coming along. But a lot, that can't explain everything. That is a lot of people who were never in the church before who are now going to church. 190,000 Black Methodists to 1 million by 1906. Yes? Yeah. Yeah.
Distributed through the South like that. Is that the same thing going on, that they could or were told to have colleges under law, but you'll have your own colleges?
Okay. Yes, this is about Reconstruction and the question of Black colleges in the South. And how did that form? This is something I could do another 3 hours on, because I've done research on this. Okay, how do I simplify this? The very first Black colleges, well, first of all, Blacks wanted education. The freed people were like, we want to learn to read, but we also want leaders who are educated. And they were, I tell my students stories of like when a Freedmen's Bureau came and told the crowd, okay, we're going to set up a school. And they just stood and cheered and gave them a standing ovation because they get to go to school. Our students ought to be that excited about education. So Blacks wanted it, and Blacks wanted to set up, and they did sometimes on their own, set up primary schools and also colleges. But you realize they don't have financial resources. 95% of them are coming out of slavery. They have nothing, practically, economically. And this is a place where whites and Blacks came together. It was Northern whites who were involved in the missionary movement, actually came and helped Blacks set up Black colleges. Initially, those schools were, the first ones were religious, and they came out of the missionary movement. And I actually know from looking at the research of this church, that this church, if you go back to 1900, and if you look at the Women's Missionary Society, they're talking about supporting Black colleges in the South. So a good number of the original historic Black colleges and universities were cooperative effort between Blacks and Northern white evangelical denominations. Later on, when segregation comes, you do have the 14th and 15th Amendment saying, well, it's got to have equality. And so then white governments would set up Black colleges or Black schools. But see, they get to still control a lot of things when they do that. They control the purse strings. And there were whites in the North who gave to those because some of those were mostly vocational schools. And they're like, we want good Black workers. Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller gave money on that. But the Black colleges that were private, where the Blacks had a lot more influence in, they were the ones that were producing a lot of the leaders for the Black community, and they were trained in sort of classical education. And so I'll just give you one example. Morehouse in Atlanta. It's where Martin Luther King comes from. And these Black colleges produce a lot of the very important Black leaders in the early 20th century. I wasn't planning on doing that, but that's a very, very good, important point. So some of those Black colleges were the one place where Blacks could control and set the terms. Although with the government, you got the white government to deal with, and sometimes even with the missionary movement with Northern white Presbyterians and Congregationalists, Baptists and Methodists, they had their tensions, in terms of how should we, do whatever. But in the end, if you look at what white leaders were saying in the 1890s, they're saying, we want schools that are producing Black lawyers and businessmen and politicians and doctors. They weren't saying this is just low-income, working-class people. So there was some important cooperation there that was going on. Anyway, the Black church grows tremendously, large part because blacks are able to call the shots. And I just want to then reinforce this point. It's more evidence to show that slavery really was a barrier to Christianity in the end. Once slavery is struck down, and what you're doing is allowing and creating a situation where blacks are able to make decisions on their own and not always be under the authority of whites, it grows dramatically. I want to say one more thing about this. In the first years after the end of the Civil War, whites, this is where things about segregation get really kind of strange. In the first year after the Civil War, whites didn't want blacks to go to independent churches. They wanted them to stay in white churches. Because they felt like they could keep an eye on them there, number one. Number two, and they're right about this, if blacks get their own churches, you know, they're going to be able to do things and you know, I mean, who knows what kind of ruckus they will cause. You know, Martin Luther King preaching in that Black Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama, 2 blocks away from the State House. I mean, you know, so the power dynamics of who gets to call the shots are very important in all of this. And Henry McNeil Turner's life, as I said, there were a couple times when he just barely escaped death from mobs that were out to get him. And he had to hightail it out of town because he was seen as a threat simply for, well, one time because he was running for office, but other times for setting up black churches. When Reconstruction collapsed, and you get into the 1880s and the 90s, and segregation starts to become firmly implanted in the South, and Jim Crow really gets established, Henry McNeil Turner got more and more disillusioned with American society. And he just was not sure whites would ever really come around. He supported actually black immigration to West Africa. Yeah, you go to Liberia, you'll be able to form a country on your own terms there. But that was a side project. What he really was doing was working as a spokesperson for blacks in America and in the South. And it was during this time that he came up with, I think, one of his most interesting little pieces of writing. It was called "God is a Negro." And this is why, I mean, he's like an early black pride, black nationalist. Now listen, pay attention to what he says here. I mean, this is most of the writing. He published this in his newspaper called The Voice of Missions that he had created himself. We have as much right biblically and otherwise, and he's responding to some white people where he'd said this earlier, and they said, "You're demented, you're crazy." He says, "We have as much right biblically and otherwise to believe that God is a Negro as you buckra or white people have to believe that God is a fine-looking, symmetrical, and ornamented white man. For the bulk of you, and all the fool Negroes of this country believe that God is a white-skinned, blue-eyed, straight-haired, projecting-nosed, compressed-lipped, and finely robed white gentleman sitting up on a throne somewhere in the heavens. Every race of people since time began who have attempted to describe their God by words or by paintings or by carvings or by any other form or figure have conveyed the idea that God who made them and shaped their destinies was symbolized in themselves. And why should not the Negro believe that he resembles God as much as other people? We do not believe that there is any hope for a race of people who do not believe that they look like God. Now, yeah, we are no stickler as to God's color anyway, but if he has any, we should prefer to believe that he's nearer symbolized in the blue sky above us and the blue water of the seas and oceans. But we certainly protest against God being a white man or against God being white at all. Abstract as this theme must forever remain while we are in the flesh. This is one of the reasons we favor African immigration or Negro nationalization, wherever we can find a domain. For as long as we remain among whites, the Negro will believe that the devil is black, and that he, the Negro, favors the devil, and that God is white, and that the Negro bears no resemblance to him. And the effect of such a sentiment is contemptuous and degrading, and one half of the Negro race will be trying to get white, and the other half will spend their days trying to be white man's scullions in order to please the whites. And the time they should be given to the study of such things that will dignify and make our race great will be devoted to studying about how unfortunate they are in not being white. We conclude these remarks by repeating, God is a Negro. Now, there's some real, I mean, you kind of have to wrap your head around this, but there's some real, I think, insights in his. First of all, there's a theological insight here. Of course, we have to symbolize God in something we can understand. This is actually why the Bible uses all sorts of metaphors for God, right? God is the good shepherd, the door, the vine, the gate, whatever, because how can you grasp God? But what is also true is that people through all times, and he talks about the color of their skin, but it's in other areas too. We now know this from the missionary movement, that people, there's a huge impact on people when they hear the word, and now when we're thinking of the word, we're thinking of the Bible, we're also thinking the word, capital W, spoken in their own language, their own heart language that they know and goes down deep into us. God speaks to us and appears to us in terms that are familiar to us. He comes, this is the incarnation. He comes down to earth and meets us where we are, in whatever situation we're in ways we can understand. In this big, grand, mysterious sort of way, this wonderful, really, sort of way. And this is part of what Turner is saying. He says, really, if we want to have God be any color, he can have him blue. But there's a problem. If you stop and think about this, there's a problem if you're always depicting God as white. Now, for whites, this is part of the familiarity. Oh yeah, I recognize this God. But if you're calling the shots for everybody, and how many paintings have you seen with Jesus with blue eyes, you are actually distancing God from other people in that way. We need, I think, just like there are many metaphors for God in the Bible, we need a range, and there are many languages by which people speak the Bible. I think it makes sense to say that there could be a range of images of God in certain ways. We need, this is how God speaks to us in ways that are familiar to us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we've seen his glory, full of grace and truth. There's such a profound point in that Turner is getting at here. But Turner also realizes, and this is the other side of it that I've alluded to, that socially, culturally, our view of God is shaped by those who set the terms. And so when you're living in a society where in every single other institution, the whites are setting the terms for things, then Turner is saying, look, we've got to be able to set the terms for God. Not set the terms for God, because God sets the terms, but we've got to make this point about how we see and understand God, and not simply let whites set the terms without our voice in the whole matter. And I think that's something that's very important for us today. You know, there's a question that naturally comes up. Why do blacks go to black churches and whites go to white churches? And it's complicated, but I think one way to ask this is, well, yeah, ask this of yourself. Why don't you just, pick up and leave Christ Presbyterian and go down and start going to a black church?
No, wait a minute.
Okay, well, sorry, the minister's in the room. But of course, we are drawn to what is familiar to us, to a place where God speaks to us in a particular way. And God speaks in all kinds of ways to different people. And so I myself am not bothered by all the different kinds of churches that we have that people go to. But I don't think we can stay here. I mean, come to this church regularly, that's fine. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, all right. But you know, it's good to visit black churches and go to worship on their terms. Yes?
Black churches usually start around 11.
Around 11.
Come here at 8:30.
You could go to the early
I'm
service.
sorry, you can go to the early service here at 8:30 and then go to the black church around 11.
So,
I'm sorry. It depends. Some are getting some are understanding that people are not going to be, they don't need to be in service forever and ever. So I would say an hour and a half, 2 hours, but it's some of you went to the service up there at People's Baptist Church and it was about 2.5 hours, but the time went by so fast because it was so moving. And so, very moving.
And if you hurry, you can catch the end of the Amish service after that.
I mean, we got Korean churches. You got little Pentecostal churches of poor white, lower income white people. We've got so many different kinds of churches. Greek Orthodox, Catholic churches. It's good to visit a lot of different kinds of churches and not only be, okay, so that's worship, but I would say it extends to other sort of things too in society, right? That we need to think about institutions and who is setting the terms. I've got a colleague at Malone, a person of color, a sociologist who's doing a study on nonprofits. He's working on a dissertation. And he says there's all these nonprofits that go into low-income neighborhoods, and 90% of the people who are working in those nonprofits are white. And I think he said something over 95% of the board members of these nonprofits are white. Okay, so there is theological, I think we're on very solid theological ground for saying we need a mix of different people. And it can be tough when you get in the same room and you start getting ideas about how you're supposed to be doing something. Actually, if you look at the book of Romans, you've got a cross-cultural thing going on right there where Paul is addressing the church in Rome, and some people are despising the other people, and some people are looking down. You've got Jewish Christians and Greek Christians, and they're different. And Paul is saying, you guys have to worship together. That's an underlying theme that the rest of his theology from Romans grows out of. And so, I mean, I think Henry McNeil Turner understood this. The missionary theorists who are looking at the theology of cross-cultural ministry are they've been doing a lot of great work in the last 50 years on these kinds of things. I think we are starting to see why actually this is important. Just the question of listening to all voices. Can you have a structure where you're listening to all voices? And are you yourself willing to say, I'm going to move out of my comfort zone and go to someplace else where somebody else is setting the terms. These are things I think these are things that we want to maybe keep in mind. Yes?
I just wanted to say, I have to leave, but I wanted to say that I am pleased with the way that this conversation is going, because this is the essence of what we need to do. Think a different way, be exposed to different things, and have an open mind, because you think a certain way, and it's from your experiences, what you've had or what you haven't, or what you ignore to and don't accept. So that's going to be what's going to change things, is for everybody to speak and talk your mind. And you might not necessarily agree with me, but if we talk through it, you might understand where I'm coming from instead of just rejecting what I'm saying. And that's what, like I say, that's the essence of what I believe we should be doing here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this is, by the way, one of the gifts, I would say, of the civil rights movement to white people. Oftentimes civil rights movement is like, here's the good things that happen to black people. There's a number of things that whites can gain from this. And one of them is this insight that you're talking about. I mean, I want to live in a country that treats people in a more just and more fair way, and the realization that, we do need to listen everything from churches to like NFL football coaches, you know. Okay, do we have NFL football coaches who are black? Because, you know, sometimes, anyway, you know, you can apply it to that issue too in all kinds of places. And a lot of that has come out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We've started to understand things better. And we're still working on it, obviously. But other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I just watched a movie called The Race.
Okay, The Race.
Yes. Do you?
I don't know this one.
Okay. It's takes place in 1938, I think, when
Oh.
Jesse Owens was.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay,
I was
yeah.
amazed that he won 4 different gold medals. Hitler was at the Olympics at the time. He wouldn't even address him or acknowledge any African American or Jewish person at the time. That he won 4 gold medals. He came home. They were having a big hado about him winning these medals, and he had to go in the back door
Mm-hmm.
in 1938 or
Mhm.
39. But
Yeah.
in the end, he gets to the elevator, and there is a person operating the elevators, which they had back then. It was a child. And he was so excited to see him, he wanted his autographed. So even though he went through the back door, through the kitchen, there was still someone excited to see him. It was heartbreaking to see that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The experiences of black people, but then also their actions, right? You know, Jesse Owens' actions, the courage of Jackie Robinson, but then other people who've a lot of courage, and sometimes have had to tell. Okay, I think George Orwell said that democracy means having the right to tell people something they don't want to hear. If you think about that, and I would, not that I can improve on George Orwell because that's ridiculous, but I would add a little bit that the flip side of that is democracy also means I ought to have the responsibility to listen to people tell me things I don't want to hear. You know, and so, you know, this is the point made. Sometimes you're going to have conflicts and disputes. It's not all going to be, you know, flowers and baby ducks and candy, but this is the hard work of working out our calling. And so people like Jesse Owens, who's able to use his gifts and his courage and his fortitude, I mean, the pressure that people like that were on, and yet just by their presence in this situation and all the things that come up with this. You know, and I go back to that earlier question I have about, you know, you're looking at that woman who says, yeah, that's maybe your child, but it's his Negro. How do you change that attitude? I mean, I don't think you ever can with that generation. But over time, there have been changes that have been made, more changes that need to be made. And I think the role of blacks in history in sort of, you know, bringing up these things and pushing and sometimes telling us things we don't want to hear are very important. And so that's why we need the humility to be able to listen. And you know, the kingdom of God is in that, I'd say. Randy?
Yesterday in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, there was a op-ed piece by Leonard Pitts, and it was titled "If something to the effect of if whites could be black." And what brought it about, there was an ad that ran in Georgia, a political ad that said, as a white person, have you been subject to racism recently? And then Pitts put it into language, well, let's take a look at this and what blacks have been subject to, and now you, as a white person, are saying you were subject to racism. But if you read the Plain Dealer or get that, it would be very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Sounds like a very important sort of issue. So, well, thank you. You know, it really is a joy to be able to come and hear your comments and share these things with you and discuss these sorts of things. So let's pray. Dear Father, we pray that you would create in us humble hearts where we are listening, where we also think about in various situations who is making the decisions, who gets to set the terms, and who can we include in the process, and how we can be a part of really listening to and recognizing all of your children. Pray that we may respond to your call in these ways. In your name we pray. Amen.